Welcome to Hungry Dads, your guided tour through the delicate and often overwhelming balancing act between food indulgences and social acceptance. And now, as always, here are your hosts, Rod Budget and Hugh Gallen.
Hello, and welcome to episode 18 of Hungry Dads. I'm Hugh Gallen.
I'm Rod Budget. And Hugh, we've spent a lot of time on the podcast talking about the husband aspect of being a hungry dad, with things like covert snacking around our wives and cooking Thanksgiving meals for the extended family. But we haven't spent much time talking about how being dads to our young children has changed the way we approach food. For those who don't know, I have two young daughters, one a preschooler and the other a toddler, and Mr. Gallen has a preschool daughter and toddler son of similar ages. So the old cliche goes, having children changes everything. And I have to admit that that really is true, even when it comes to food. How exactly has it changed Rod Budget's approach to food and eating? In many ways, actually, but the more I reflected on it, there was one overriding theme that dominates all of the food changes that come with being a dad. So with that being said, I'm going to present a segment called Dad the Hypocrite. That's right, I'm a huge hypocrite when it comes to almost all food-related issues with my kids. And I've identified 5 main areas where I'm hypocritical, rank them from what I perceive to be the most obvious or maybe forgivable hypocritical behaviors to some more niche and perhaps less forgivable behaviors. So let's get started with the segment, and I'm eager to get Hugh's reaction to these since he's in the same fatherhood food boat.
Rod, if you don't mind, I'm going to take the liberty to rename your segment, and I'd like to call it Hungry, Hungry Hypocrites.
They're hungry, hungry hippos!
So let's start with number 1, and this is a pretty obvious one, I think, and this is me insisting that my children eat their vegetables. And actually, it's no longer insisting, but more of begging and pleading that they need to eat their vegetables at this point. Our preschooler is basically down to eating only broccoli if there is Parmesan cheese sprinkled on top. That's the only one without having a huge fight or bribing her with some other offer. The toddler is still a little more flexible, but not much. She'll readily eat broccoli. She'll eat peas, but not carrots. So of course we got a peas and carrots medley mixed together, and she picks out the peas and it has a tray full of square carrots left behind. She's definitely rejecting more than she's consuming at this point. So here's my main takeaway from having kids who don't like vegetables. It just validates my thinking all along. Most vegetables don't taste very good, especially if they're not slathered in butter or some other seasoning. There was a time when I was a young childless adult where I would think something like, I need to grow up and start liking vegetables. I'm 25 years old. I need to be getting vegetables as a side dish instead of potatoes. Why don't I like them? I'm an adult now. Come on. So in a way, seeing a toddler reject veggies is quite validating. She has no social influences telling her that the vegetables don't taste good. She puts them in her mouth, focuses for a split second or two, scrunches up her nose, and spits them out. But that's where hypocritical dad comes into play. I'll say something like, hey, those are yummy. Eat your yummy veggies. When I myself would rather have a cracker, or peanut butter, or a banana. Listen, I do enjoy some vegetables now when prepared properly. I have no doubt in my mind that a certain, maybe small percentage of the population really does like the taste of a big plate of steamed vegetables. So I'm not bashing vegetable consumption by any means. But if I were speaking absolutely freely to my kids without being hypocritical dad, I'd say something like, yeah, those don't taste very good, but try to eat some every once in a while. They're good for your body, but no, they aren't inherently yummy. I don't know, Hugh. What do you think? Do you agree with me? Can you relate to me on this one?
Yeah, I think you hit on 2 really keen points here. The first one being that despite the outward enforcement of vegetables being yummy, as we try to tell them, they clearly are able, at even the youngest of ages, to start to form their own opinions. So there has to be something deeper there that they just don't taste good, at least to kids and, frankly, to this adult. And so it's that nature versus nurture argument at its core. And most people don't think vegetables taste very good, and I don't care how much you try to nurture it. Kids are too smart for that. The other point you mentioned, which I think is worth noting, is you can start to like them a little bit more when they're prepared well. And I remember as an adult starting to go to some restaurants, and I'd get vegetables, and I remember remarking, oh, these are pretty good. And they weren't necessarily slathered in butter, but they were just prepared better than my mom made them. And so I decided, oh, the whole reason I didn't like vegetables must be because my mom just didn't give them the care they needed. Well, as a parent, trying to prepare dinner, trying to prepare vegetables, I can say that I am no better at preparing vegetables and making them delicious than my mother was. I tried a few tricks with a lot of attention and a lot of care. You can start to make them palatable, but even with my best efforts to do something with vegetables, my kids pretty much still ignore them. And so the effort goes away very quickly. You steam them a little bit, maybe just warm them in the microwave even, and then just try to cram a few down their throat. So to my dear mother, who I judged, you did your best. I wasn't going to eat them no matter what. And now the roles have reversed.
Oh, that's beautiful. Hungry dads bringing people together.
We're hungry, hungry hippos. We're in an eating race. Hungry, hungry hippo.
My second hypocritical dad example is not sharing my food with the kids. Obviously, one of the key teaching points of parenthood is focusing on how it's nice to share. We should always share with our sister, with our friends, etc. Well, when it comes to my food, I almost never share. And you know why? Because these kids are relentless once you let them have a taste. They're like dogs. They don't have the social graces. Maybe the preschooler has the social graces and just doesn't care at this point. But they can't acknowledge it. They just ate a huge breakfast. Daddy is eating his breakfast, which consists of a single protein bar. And maybe they don't need to beg for a bite, which will turn into several bites, which will turn into them eating 2/3 of my tiny breakfast. And that's the real problem. If I could give them each just a tiny bite of my food and be done with it, that's fine. But the begging never stops, and it just encourages them to beg more. If I'm being completely honest, I still share with them more than I should or care to admit probably. But I'm still being a hypocritical dad because I stress sharing on a daily basis as one of the most important fundamental principles of being a kind person. But then I exhibit the exact opposite behavior when it comes to my food.
So when you talk about sharing your food, I assume you're talking about sharing delicious food. Are you talking about sharing food that they wouldn't be able to eat and it's special for daddy? Or is this just your share of the dinner?
This is both. It's my share if we're all sitting around the dinner table. I will try not to share with them, or if I'm eating something, just kind of standing around in the kitchen, and it's something that they might eat anyway, but it's more that they've just eaten usually, or I know they're eating plenty of food and they just want what I have. So there's a certain principle behind it. I'd say it's a two-part thing. I'm generally eating what I need and not more than that, so I don't want to be giving away my food. And I know they're eating plenty, and it annoys me that they just keep asking.
Yeah, we've got a 1-year-old who is very, very whiny most of the time we're around. And we finally cracked the code that we cannot go into the kitchen for anything. Once we go into the kitchen, even for a glass of water, something triggers in him, and he thinks he's missing out on something to eat or drink, and he'll whine until he gets it, even if there's nothing to get. So yes, I can appreciate this problem.
Yeah, we had a similar issue with our 1-year-old, perhaps even more dramatic, in that we couldn't open the refrigerator for a while without the toddler going up to the fridge and just whining and whining and whining for milk. Yeah, I don't feel so bad about not sharing.
You better eat fast, that food won't last. They're hungry, hungry hippos.
Number 3 in the hypocritical dad rundown is telling the kids to be patient at restaurants when we dine out. The toddler is at an age where she's definitely familiar with her surroundings and knows what's up the second we walk into a restaurant. She generally holds it together while we're being seated, but as soon as her butt hits the high chair, she emits a high-pitched wail, and then some corresponding low-pitched moans while writhing about. It's like beat the clock trying to dig some Cheerios out of a diaper bag while putting a bib on her before she disrupts the entire restaurant. The preschooler isn't much better. As soon as we're seated, she'll say loudly, "Where's our bread? I want bread." Or if we're not at a restaurant that serves bread, she'll say, "Where's our waiter? I want my drink." Of course, I tell them to be patient, settle down, we'll get our food soon, but here's the thing. Inside, I'm feeling the exact same way. I'm primed to eat and I want some food, or at least a drink in front of me ASAP. I like to think of myself as a patient person in general, but when I'm at a restaurant, some sort of animalistic instinct just kicks in. If the food takes longer than normal to come out, I get really, really antsy. Even if I'm just ordering at a counter at like a fast food place, and the food isn't immediately available and they say I'm gonna have to wait, I get annoyed. And if I'm being perfectly honest with our listeners, as I try to be, I'd act the exact same way they do if I didn't know any better. I'd be asking loudly for bread and maybe even grunting from time to time. Hugh, am I being too much of an animal here?
In a sit-down restaurant, it's hard to concentrate on anything until you get those bread or those tortilla chips if they're serving that stuff. It's very easy to become preoccupied. In a fast food scenario, I'll be honest, if I walk into the place and there's even like 2 people in line, I'll just turn around and go to the next place. Forget it. I'm out of there. I do have the great good fortune of being in Manhattan, where 2 steps down there's another option. But I'm not waiting, especially for something like a slice of pizza. I should be able to walk up and get it and be out within a minute.
I'm glad to know it's not just me, because I can definitely relate. But this doesn't make me a hypocrite, because I'll scold them for not being patient.
They're hungry, hungry hippos.
Hypocritical example number 4 is covert eating, which is something we touched on in episode 3, but that was sneaking around our loving and caring wives' backs. But covert eating definitely comes into play with kids as well. And with children, I think there are 2 main subcategories to covert eating. First is eating a food that the kids know is in the house, but hiding in order to do so. I do this pretty often with the aforementioned breakfast protein bars. They're kept in a large walk-in pantry, so if the kids are hovering about in the playroom, or sometimes even in the kitchen, although that's very risky, I'll duck into the pantry, close the door, and scarf down a protein bar in the dark. Or maybe I'll take a food item into the bathroom while I'm on my way to the shower, or stand in the laundry room to consume some tortilla chips and guacamole. The top of our dryer is a perfect flat surface at a great height for a nice spread of chips and dip. Don't ask me how I know, but I know. Now, I don't know if this sort of action is actually hypocritical or just unethical. I think this one kind of skirts the line. I mean, they know the food is in the house. I just need some peace and quiet to have a nice meal of crab dip on top of the dryer every once in a while. The second subcategory of covert eating around the kids is definitely hypocritical, though. This is eating things that the kids don't know are kept in the house, or even worse, eating things that you told them are gone. Say everyone has a little scoop of ice cream for dinner one night, a little treat. The preschooler is inevitably going to ask about it the next day. Can we have ice cream again? No, honey, the ice cream is all gone. In actuality, the ice cream is hidden under a pile of frozen vegetables in the bottom of the freezer. There's still a good half-gallon left, and Daddy is going to scoop it straight out of the tub into his mouth once you go to bed. This sort of covert eating is done almost exclusively when the preschooler is in bed or out of the house. You know, she's also getting out of bed more and more these days for water or to go to the potty. So there have been a lot of close calls involving, diving over the back of the couch or throwing food across the room or hiding M&Ms in my cheek like a squirrel while she's out there looking at me. It's risky business, but necessary in my opinion. Admittedly, this is flat out lying. Albeit, I would consider it a white lie. But again, lying is very, very bad and you should never do it. Unless you're a hypocritical dad. Hugh, I don't know. Is this lying going too far?
I think I can help you out with this one a little bit. With respect to the having to hide to eat things, I don't know if your kids are anything like mine, but it doesn't even have to come down to it being some sort of unhealthy food that I'm keeping from them. It's just literally they want what I want. Earlier this week, I was fighting a little cold, and we had 2 oranges left in the fridge, and I wanted to eat them to help fight my cold, and just because I felt like eating a couple oranges. I knew the minute I walked out with those oranges, they were going to come out grubby hands, squeezing to try to take my orange from me. Not only did I know that they'd want to take it, but I also knew that whatever pieces I gave them, they'd hardly eat. They'd touch it, they'd put it in their mouth, they might eat some of it, but then they'd keep asking for more, and I ended up not getting any of my vitamin C that I so desperately needed. So I literally went into the bathroom, sat on the toilet, and ate 2 oranges so that I could get all of the vitamin C that I felt I needed.
Wow. That makes me feel a little better. I don't know if I can justify that with something like ice cream, but it's good to hear that there are other dads out there doing these sorts of things.
You better eat fast, that food won't last. They're hungry, hungry hippos.
My final hypocritical dad example is one that's a little more niche, I think, and some listeners might consider this less offensive than lying or not sharing, but this one really hits me hard. And what I'm talking about is scolding the preschooler for playing with her food, and to a lesser extent for being messy. She's at the age of discovery where everything is pretty cool to her. This includes things like blowing into her straw to make bubbles in her milk, taking her gum out of her mouth to examine it, or trying to catch grapes in her mouth. As a dad, I toe the company line and say, cut it out, this isn't polite, you're gonna make a mess. But it tears me up a little bit, because if I'm being completely honest, it's pretty cool to make bubbles in your drink, or catch things in your mouth, or let spaghetti just run all down your face and slurp it into your mouth. I'm such a hypocrite on this one. I want to play with my food. I am, in fact, a much messier eater than the average adult male. This one's tough on me. It's eating me up a little bit inside. I'm speaking from the heart.
Hungry Dads.
I've done Food for Thought before, but this one is a very focused event. Tonight for Food for Thought, I'm going to be speaking to you about 3 specific experiments that were done in behavioral psychology related to food.
You gonna get psyched up? Yeah, I'm psyched. Get really psyched up. I'm really psyched. Yeah, I'm psyched. All right.
The first one is somewhat famous. You might have heard of it. It's called the Stanford Marshmallow Experiment, or as I'm going to call it, but I want it now. This was a series of studies on delayed gratification in the late 60s and early 70s at Stanford University. Have you heard of the marshmallow experiment?
I have heard of the marshmallow experiment. I think I first heard of it from my lovely wife, Mrs. Budget.
Good, so I'll get through it pretty quickly. Basically, they had a child about 4 to 6 years old who was for the choice between having 1 marshmallow or maybe a cookie right away, or if they waited about 15 minutes, they could have 2. They were left alone for a while, and then their reactions were recorded. Most of the kids did not eat the marshmallow right away. That's somewhat interesting, but the most interesting part of this experiment is that 30 years later, they followed up with these kids. And they found that the ones who delayed their gratification were more successful. So, what do you think? Would you have been the kid who would have eaten the first marshmallow? Or do you think you could have held out?
Oh, man, that's tough because, as you have heard from our previous segment, I love to eat. Once I get in a restaurant, I'm ready to go. But at the same time, as a kid especially, I tended to go with authority. And not that they were telling the kids what to do, but I think I was savvy enough to know that they probably wanted you to not eat the marshmallow. So I'm going to say as a kid, I probably would have waited. But as an adult, I may have eaten the marshmallow.
And what do you think your kids would do nowadays? Your kids?
We've actually, with our preschooler, we've tried this experiment.
Do you hook electrodes up to her head?
Yes.
And, have a screen showing her brainwaves?
The situation, what we proposed to her was she could either eat something unhealthy, a small amount immediately, or have more of it later. Say you could have 3 M&Ms over the next 3 hours, or 1 M&M right now. And she took the 1 M&M. This was a while back, so I don't know age-wise. She was probably a little bit younger than some of the experiment subjects, but she went with the immediate gratification.
Reading stuff like this scares me if I think about it too long, because it starts to seem so fatalistic, and I'd be afraid to do the experiment, because if she failed or he failed, that I'd just pretty much come to the conclusion that my children are going to be failures and there's nothing I can do about it.
Yeah, their SAT scores will be horrible, and they will be probably convicted criminals at some point in their life.
Get really psyched up. I'm really psyched.
The second experiment I want to talk about came from the University of Surrey, England, in 2006. And the title was A Role for Overt and Covert Parental Control in Children's Snacking Behavior. Or, as I'm going to call it, do I have to set a good example for my kids, or can I just boss them around? And what this study did was it took parents of children aged 4 to 11 and asked them questions about the ways in which they assert control over their children's eating. And one way was overt control, which is basically telling them not to eat bad foods. And then the other way was covert control, or doing things that cannot be immediately noticed by the child, but has an effect, like keeping bad food out of the house and avoiding going to places that serve bad food. So they'd ask questions like, do you avoid going to restaurants that sell unhealthy foods? Do you avoid buying sweets? Do you not buy foods that you would like because you don't want your children to have them? And they took the answers to these questions and they crunched all the numbers. And the finding was that this kind of covert control, or this indirect control, keeping the foods out of the house, not going to the restaurants, definitely resulted in healthier food choices for the kids. It was kind of the do what I do, not do what I say form of parenting. Now, what do you think they found out about the more overt control and just telling kids what to do?
I would guess that it did not work, or perhaps even it backfired and the kids, being the contrarians they are, wanted food more.
So that was the result of a series of studies. This paper was kind of inconclusive on this, but it noted several studies, other studies that showed that this overt control, this direct control, just telling kids what to do, resulted in overeating and a lack of restraint. This really speaks to what we've talked about, Rod, wanting to enjoy our food and maybe do it covertly and kind of lie to the kids. And to go back to some of your earlier points, I think, if we can have our cake and eat it too, we can maybe have the food in the house as long as we hide it well, kind of do the covert control over the children as long as we can keep them in the dark.
Yeah, I think we want to eat our cake and not have them eat it too.
I was a little afraid to have Mrs. Gallen even learn about this study because it's really, really going to validate all the things she always says about how we can't have this stuff in the house. And I know she was right, but now that there's a scientific study in front of me and she finds out about it, she knows I can't argue with science.
You gonna get psyched up? Yeah, I'm psyched!
The last study that I took a look at in this Food for Thought special edition was imagery in human classical conditioning, or do sandwiches taste better when someone else makes them? And what this study talked about was the idea that thinking about food can have the same effect as eating it, albeit less intensely. So these researchers at Carnegie Mellon University theorized and studied and basically proved that when you think about a particular food, you become less hungry for it later. They extrapolated that to say that when you make your own sandwich, you're going to anticipate its taste and you're going to, as they said, quote unquote, pre-consume it in a certain way where once you eat it, you're not going to value it as much. Seeing yourself make the sandwich over this time makes it feel less novel and you come to expect the flavors and you've maybe burned yourself out already on the sandwich. What do you think? Do you like a sandwich made by someone else or do you need to make a sandwich on your own?
That's tough because I feel like the sandwiches that I eat that are prepared by someone else generally are larger and kind of have better stuff and better bread, whereas if I'm making a sandwich at home, it's probably going to be 2 pieces of wheat bread and a little bit of lunch meat. So I tend to lean more towards having someone else make it for me, but I don't know if it's because I'm picturing like a large deli sandwich versus me just making a smaller sandwich. So let me quickly try to envision a similar size sandwich made by someone else and made by myself. And I still think that I want someone else to make it for me because I assume they have experience making a sandwich more so than I do.
I know that just here in my own home, sometimes I'd make my wife's sandwich for her or vice versa. And even before I saw this study, we would think that it did taste better when the other one made it. Except that this wasn't always true. It took a while for us to figure out how we liked each other's sandwiches. And so there's a lot of other X factors in there that are much more particular and less psychological that you got to think about when you're talking about enjoyment of a sandwich made by another person. I think you got to assume that this other person is making the sandwich the way you want it. My wife needs her peanut butter spread to the very edge, evenly distributed throughout the sandwich. Same with jelly. And early on, if I didn't do it that way, it didn't get a good review. But now that I've got the sandwich down, she insists when I make the sandwich for her, it tastes better.
Hungry Dads! Visit our website at hungrydads.com. Follow us on Twitter at hungry_dads. This has been a Hungry Dads production. So the old cliche goes, Mr. Gallen has a most obvious explosive diaper